There is a certain kind of person who disappears without warning. Not suddenly, not dramatically. They just slowly become unavailable. They stop responding as quickly. They cancel plans without much explanation. And eventually, the silence grows long enough that people stop asking. From the outside, it can look like independence, or maturity, or simply a preference for solitude. But there is something underneath that quiet withdrawal that most people never examine. Because the distance is never really about other people. It rarely is. Most people, when they pull away from others, believe they are protecting their peace. And maybe they are in some small way. But beneath that, beneath the careful management of who gets in and who stays out, there is usually something that doesn't want to be seen. Not by others, by yourself. There was a person who, by most measures, had a full life. Work that paid well, a small circle of people who knew them well enough, a routine that held things together, nothing obviously broken. But over time, something shifted. It started with small withdrawals, a conversation that felt too demanding, a friendship that began to feel like it asked for more than it gave, a family gathering that left them drained for days after. So they started creating space. Reasonable space, they told themselves. Healthy boundaries, they called it. They stopped committing to things that felt heavy. They stopped initiating with people they found exhausting. They became more selective about time, about energy, about who was allowed close. And for a while, it felt like relief. The noise quieted, the obligations shrank. The space around them grew wider and more manageable. But somewhere in that expanding quiet, something else started to show up. A restlessness that didn't have a clear source, a low-grade irritability that surfaced unexpectedly, a vague sense of disconnection that couldn't be explained away by being tired or busy. They noticed it first in small moments, sitting alone in the evening, a conversation replaying itself without invitation, a name surfacing in memory, a scene from years ago, suddenly present and oddly sharp. They didn't linger on it. There was no reason to. They were at peace after all. They had chosen this. But every so often, late and quiet, something in them stirred that felt like neither peace nor solitude. It felt like avoidance. One part of them spoke clearly. I needed this, I was giving too much. I was always the one managing everyone else's feelings while mine went unacknowledged. Stepping back was not a failure, it was survival. And that part was not wrong. There is real exhaustion in always being the one who adjusts. Real fatigue in reading the room while no one reads yours. When you finally stop, when you let the phone go unanswered and the invitation go declined, there is a genuine release in that. Something tight in the chest loosens. The mental noise reduces. You can breathe in a way that feels unfamiliar because it is not occupied by someone else's needs. So this voice had evidence. It could point to moments. It could name specific people and specific failures. It had assembled a case over months, maybe years, and the case held together. But there was another voice, quieter, less willing to present itself directly. It did not argue with the first. It did not arrive with counter-evidence or logical corrections. It surfaced differently in the gap between being alone and feeling at rest. In that specific quality of silence that is not quite peace. It asked different questions. Why does the silence feel slightly off? Why do certain people, when their names come up, produce something that is not quite anger and not quite sadness? Why does it feel easier to create distance than to say what is actually true? And then, the one it almost never asked directly, but which sat underneath all the others. What is it that I am not looking at? These two voices did not argue loudly. They did not confront each other directly. Instead, they coexisted in a kind of controlled tension. The first voice stayed in the foreground, organized, articulate, capable of producing a convincing account at any moment. The second voice operated below that, surfacing in fragments, in the way a memory returned without being invited, in the quality of attention that snagged on certain names and refused to let go completely. The first voice built the case. The second voice waited. This is where it gets uncomfortable. Because most people who cut others off do not experience it as emotional avoidance. They experience it as clarity, a clearing out of what no longer serves, a restructuring of priorities. The feeling is real. The logic is coherent. Both of those things can be true at the same time that something else is also happening, something that the clarity and the logic are quietly designed not to reach. And yet, something about the silence never quite settles. You've probably felt this before. That particular quality of unfinished business that follows you into the quietest rooms. Not grief, not guilt, something harder to name than either of those. The mind is extraordinarily good at constructing justifications that feel like wisdom. When we step back from people, we tell ourselves a story. The story is usually about them. They were too much. They were not reciprocal. They did not meet us where we needed to be met. The friendship had run its course. The relationship had become one-sided. These things may all be true. But there is often a second layer that the story carefully avoids. Not what they did, but what they triggered. Imagine this. Someone says something small, an offhand comment, a passing observation, and something inside you shuts down, not from pain exactly, but from recognition, like they have touched something you were not ready to look at. And instead of examining what was touched, you file the person away. Too much, you decide, not safe, you conclude. The filing feels rational. The conclusion feels chosen. But the thing that was touched, it stays. It does not disappear with the person. It moves back into the interior, quiet and unexamined, waiting for the next thing to brush against it. This is how the pattern grows without appearing to be a pattern. Each withdrawal feels like a specific and reasonable response to a specific and unreasonable person. But over time, the circle narrows. The people who remain are the ones who have learned, whether consciously or not to ask too much, not to come too close, not to say the things that reach the places you guard. It usually looks like this. A person surveys their relationships and feels, genuinely, that they have simply become more discerning. They no longer have time for drama. They no longer tolerate people who drain them. They have gotten better at protecting their energy. And each of those statements, taken alone, sounds healthy. But look at what is absent from that inventory. There is no mention of what they are protecting the energy for. No mention of what they want but have stopped reaching toward. No mention of what they might be keeping at a distance that is not drama, not drain, not low quality, but simply too honest or too close or too willing to see something they are not ready to have seen. The pattern hides inside the language of self-care. That is part of what makes it so difficult to examine. And this is where most people don't notice the shift. Because the narrowing never announces itself. It does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as a preference, a gradual refinement of the inner environment until it contains only what you can manage, only what does not press against the edges of what you have decided to keep contained. The hidden logic underneath all of it goes something like this. If I never let anyone close enough to see the parts of me I haven't dealt with, those parts never become real. They stay theoretical, manageable, mine. It is a kind of control that looks from the outside like selectivity, like discernment, like someone who simply knows themselves well enough to choose their company carefully. And maybe that is some of what it is. But beneath the selectivity is often something more specific. A set of internal alarm systems, finely tuned, barely visible, that fire whenever a person or situation begins to approach the territory that has been marked off. Part of you already knows this. You can feel it in the way certain conversations make you careful, in the way you sometimes choose silence not because you have nothing to say, but because the thing you might say feels too exposed. In the way even intimacy, real intimacy, the kind that asks something of you, can produce in you something that resembles, just slightly, a threat. The defensive narrative keeps all of this at a distance. It says they were the problem, and it is never entirely lying, but it is never telling the whole story either. Carl Jung spent much of his life trying to understand the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. He called it the shadow. Not a metaphor for evil, not a romantic concept about darkness. Simply the collection of qualities, impulses, and truths about ourselves that we find unacceptable, and so we push them below the surface, usually without realizing we are doing it. The shadow forms early. Most of us learn before we can articulate it that certain parts of ourselves are not welcome. The anger was too loud, the need was too much. The sadness was inconvenient, the ambition made others uncomfortable, the vulnerability felt dangerous. So we adapted. We became the version of ourselves that was acceptable, competent, contained, low maintenance. The one who doesn't ask for too much, doesn't feel too loudly, doesn't let things show that might unsettle the people around them. And for a long time this works. But what we pushed below the surface did not dissolve, it collected. And here is what Jung understood about the shadow that most people miss. It does not disappear when we suppress it, it moves. It projects outward onto others. The things we cannot tolerate in ourselves we begin to see in the people around us. The anger we won't claim, the need we dismiss, the vulnerability we refuse. We encounter these things in other people and they produce in us a disproportionate response, irritation, judgment, a desire to create distance. Jung called this projection, and it is one of the quietest forms of self-deception available to us. When someone cuts off a relationship because the other person was too nighty, there may be genuine truth in that observation. But beneath it sometimes is the discomfort of encountering one's own unacknowledged need, not theirs, yours. When someone withdraws because others are too emotional, it is worth pausing on that, because the emotion that feels unbearable to witness is rarely random. It tends to land on the specific register of feeling that you have worked hardest to keep quiet in yourself. When someone withdraws because others are too much, it is worth asking, too much of what exactly? Too direct, too honest, too willing to say the things that you have been practicing not to feel. The distance that feels like protection is sometimes the distance between yourself and the parts of yourself you have sent away. Picture a moment where someone close to you expressed something openly, a need, a frustration, an admission of wanting more, and something in you contracted, not with compassion, with something colder, a faint disgust or the urge to exit the conversation quickly. In that contraction there is information, not about them, about what you cannot yet hold in yourself. This is not an accusation. Jung was never interested in accusation. He was interested in integration, the process of turning toward what we have suppressed, not to be consumed by it, not to perform it, not to become undone by it, but to carry it more honestly, to become more whole. The shadow, when met, does not destroy you, it completes you. That is what most people never find out. Something shifts when this lands. Not immediately, not as a revelation. It usually arrives quietly in the middle of an ordinary moment. You are thinking about someone you have distanced yourself from, and instead of feeling the familiar justification, you feel something slightly different, a flicker of recognition, a question you have not asked before. What was it about them that felt unbearable? Not what they did, what did they reflect? Because the shadow does not announce itself. It moves through irritation, through overreaction, through the particular people and situations that produce in you a response larger than the circumstance seems to warrant. The colleague whose confidence annoyed you. The friend whose openness felt invasive. The family member whose emotion felt like a demand. The acquaintance you quietly disliked before you could explain why. These responses are not random. They tend to cluster around the same material, the same suppressed quality appearing in different forms, triggering the same managed retreat. And when you look at the people you have cut off, really look, not through the lens of what they did wrong, but through the lens of what they made you feel, a pattern may begin to surface. Maybe they all asked you for honesty in some form. Maybe they all, in their different ways, wanted more of you than you were prepared to give. Not more time, not more effort, more of the actual interior. The parts that are uncertain or wanting or afraid. Or maybe it goes the other direction. Maybe what you could not tolerate in them was a quality you once had and systematically dismantled. The openness you trained yourself out of. The need you decided was a liability. Seeing it in someone else, unguarded and unapologetic, produces something that feels like irritation, but is closer to grief. Most people don't realize they're doing this. They believe the story their discomfort tells. That person is too fragile. That person asks too much. That person doesn't understand how the world works, and those conclusions carry enough truth to be convincing. But beneath the conclusion is the shadow, recognizing itself, pulling away from the mirror. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways, in the quick decision to step back, in the preference for people who don't ask too much, in the relief of solitude that carries within it sometimes a faint but persistent loneliness. Or maybe it appears differently for you. Maybe it is not other people's emotions that trigger it, but their certainty, or their ease, or the particular way they move through life without the level of self-monitoring that you consider simply being realistic. Whatever form it takes, the shadow is not asking you to collapse into every feeling you have ever avoided. It is asking quietly for acknowledgement, just to be looked at, just to be allowed into the conversation you have with yourself instead of being managed out of it. Here is what is simple and difficult at the same time. Cutting people off is sometimes necessary. Boundaries are real. Some relationships do not deserve continued access. Some people are genuinely harmful, and the only sane response is to move away from them and stay away. That is not what this is about. This is about the relationships that ended not because of clear and consistent harm, but because something in them became uncomfortable in a way that was hard to name. The friendships that quietly dissolved because the other person started getting too close to something. The conversations that were stopped before they reached the place they were heading. The connections that were filed away under vague labels. We grew apart, the energy was off, it stopped feeling right. But there is a difference between choosing distance from a clear and grounded place and creating distance because closeness has become threatening. The difference is not always obvious from the inside. When closeness feels dangerous, the mind constructs very reasonable explanations for why it should be avoided. These explanations are not lies exactly. They are incomplete truths. They describe what is real while omitting what is inconvenient. The omitted part is usually something about yourself. A quality you have dismissed, a feeling you have decided is weakness, a need you have learned to manage rather than meet, an aspect of your interior that you have concluded at some point, perhaps long ago, is not safe to acknowledge, not in front of others, sometimes not even in front of yourself. And until that part is turned toward, not fixed, not resolved, not performed, just honestly acknowledged, the pattern continues. The circle narrows. The people who are allowed to remain are the ones who never trigger the shadow, which means they are also the ones who never fully see you. That is the quiet cost. Not solitude, not independence. A particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unmet, because the parts of you that most need to be met have been carefully placed out of reach. You might try noticing just once the next time the impulse arrives to create distance, what it is exactly that you are moving away from, not the person, the feeling, the thing in you that the person activated. Not to stop yourself, not to force a different choice, just to see it clearly for a moment before the mind builds the story around it. That small pause, that one honest look. It does not have to become anything more than that, but it tends to. You are not cutting people off because they are too much. You are cutting them off because something they touched is too much, and you have not yet decided to look at what that is. This is not a directive. You do not need to call anyone. You do not need to reverse a decision. You do not need to examine every relationship you have ever ended. But there may be one person, one conversation, one moment of withdrawal that has stayed quietly present even after the distance was established. That slight weight, that unresolved thing. You might try simply noticing it. Not acting on it, not explaining it away, just observing it with a small degree of honesty. Jung's work was not about becoming a different person. It was about becoming a more complete one. The parts of yourself that you have distanced are not your worst qualities. Often they are your most human ones, the ones that hunger and ache and want to be known. The shadow is not asking you to be seen by everyone, only by yourself. And that quietly is where it begins.